loose items in the pouch in front of you.
Have a safe and informative journey.
Hello, I'm Nathan Hartman, and this is Dreamfinders, a podcast about the creative culture of Disney theme parks. We've all taken journeys to visit places that connect us with the moments in history we love, and for many Disney fans, that can include Walt's hometown of Marceline and, of course, his original theme park, Disneyland. But those places only bookend Walt's life, leaving many experiences in between. That's where Christopher Tremblay comes in. A Disney fan with a passion for Walt's life, Tremblay has authored Walts Pilgrimage, a guidebook that covers all the places in America that were important to both Walt professionally and personally. Tremblay chats with me about his Disney-centered college course that was the foundation for this book, his own experiences as a cast member in the Disney College program, and what drives him even now to dig deeper into the life of Walt Disney. All of that and more is coming right up on Dreamfinders. Christopher Tremblay, welcome to Dreamfinders.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So before we get into your books, I should say at this point, about Walt Disney and Disney stuff, I want to talk about your first trip to Disney, which I believe was at 5, correct?
It was, yes. My parents, we were visiting my grandma, my Busha, who lived in Tampa. And so while we were down there, my parents took me to the Magic Kingdom of the Walt Disney World Resort. And so that was my first experience, and pretty memorable because we went at Christmas time, which back then in the 1970s, they did not, the park wasn't as popular. And so I felt like we had the park to ourselves, and we would run into characters in the park, unlike it is today where it's a little more structured.
Do you remember any what sort of specific things really do you remember? I know 5 is pretty young, but even when I think about my first trip, like there's images and things, and maybe they're influenced by photos, but were there moments that you sort of keep close to your heart even now?
Yeah, I mean, definitely riding Space Mountain. And that could have been when I was 5 or when we went back when I was 7. That part I can't totally recollect. But I thought it was cool because my family was a family of 3, and the seating back then was, 3 people per car. So I thought it was cool that my whole family, we could ride together in space. So that was a fun experience. And then again, I think just getting photos taken with the characters, I remember Pluto was, pretty entertaining and playful with me. And so that was fun. And then, even just watching the parade, and getting pictures of that and seeing all of the entertainment. So those are some of the highlights from those early trips there.
And of course, this is Magic Kingdom, but not necessarily a park. Well, a park Walt sort of walked in. He walked on dirt. We'll call it that.
Right.
There's a big difference, though, between going to the Magic Kingdom and then for someone like yourself who is such a Walton, like a Walt person, clearly. Do you remember your first trip to Disneyland and seeing the original vision?
I do. So I was in college and went to go visit my uncle who lived in Burbank. And I ended up meeting up with some friends who were also visiting California on spring break. And so I met up with them. And so the 3 of us, went through the park. But for me at that time, I think it was more of definitely the typical theme park experience. So while I was aware of Walt's contributions, definitely not to the same extent as I do now. And so, again, it was just fun to be in the park, obviously much smaller size, much smaller scale, but still, just a great experience for me.
So let me ask you then, if it wasn't for your trips, you eventually, of course, go to the college program. I'm curious that transition from sort of going, well, this is something I enjoy and I like, to deciding to go to that college program. What got you more invested in the Disney history and wanting to be at the theme parks?
Right. So when I was in high school, I had a job at a restaurant, and I remember that one of the women I work with had just come back from doing, the Walt Disney World College Program, as it was called back then. And so from that very point, I wrote for information about the program. And so my dream was I was going to do that college program when I went to college. And so when the Disney cast member came to do interviews, I actually interviewed 3 times before I finally got accepted into the program. And I think, again, that was meant to be, because I ended up doing my senior honors thesis on a Disney topic, which I was able to conduct interviews and do original research while I was on the college program toward the end of my college career at Western Michigan University.
And let's talk about that. That's promoting Square Feet with Character, which is your look at the influence of fantasy on meetings and conventions at Walt Disney World, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So I was a public relations major, but also had a lot of interest in marketing. And I used to collect lots of Disney literature and, do a lot of scanning of different things. And I had started noticing that there were lots of ads, for Disney's convention and meeting space. And they were using a lot of the characters and a lot of the Disney stories in their promotional materials. And so I talked to my advisor about doing a content analysis as my senior honors thesis. And so that's what I did. I basically analyzed those materials and then conducted interviews of people who worked in the meeting and convention space, both on Disney property and off Disney property. And that became my senior honors thesis.
Now, this is a really nerdy podcast, I should say. So, because of that, I'm curious if you go a little deeper into this thesis. What did you find? What makes having a meeting or a convention at Walt Disney World, I guess, more magical for the business?
Well, I think definitely the influence of the Disney storytelling, right? I think from what I remember, and of course this was like 20 years ago when I completed my thesis, but it was basically they were using the Disney brand, to sell the experience of host your conference or meeting at the Walt Disney World Resort. And, just the inclusion of the characters that they could have and the different amenities they could offer and the different themes they could do that were connected to the Disney movies. So again, that's what they were packaging and selling. And so it was I don't think anybody was surprised by it, but, I basically, essentially evaluated, how much that was happening and how much was Disney capitalizing, on their own brand, which I think for me goes back to my, interest in Walt Disney's life and his just kind of synergistic approach of repurposing his content, his assets into something new. And so the application of, the Disney themes and the Disney characters, into meetings to make the meetings more interesting and thematic, to attract people. Again, that's what I think makes their destination unique for people who do want to host a meeting or a convention or a conference there. Obviously you also get the benefit of either doing something, renting out a part of the park, and so there's also that bonus that you get besides it just being a total vacation destination. So it also makes it easier for families to join, an adult on a conference when you're heading to a Disney resort.
How did the Disney Institute kind of play into this? At the time, that there was a big initiative at some point, especially in the 90s, to make the Institute like a grander thing beyond corporations. Of course, they still have the Institute. It's sort of for success and business-oriented meetups and things like that. But did the Institute play any role in sort of the offerings on site?
Great question. I don't recall that I had included a lot of information about the Institute. I was certainly familiar with it, and having worked as a cast member at Walt Disney World, knew, it was basically in full swing in its kind of formal location down in Florida. And I think they definitely were making some connections there, but I don't think I saw a huge prominence of it in the advertising and the promotional materials that I particularly analyzed. It was more of the, I still remember some of the Cinderella, bippity boppity boo, and just playing off words, so it was both, their photography as well as their messaging that I really, kind of concentrated on.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that college program experience. What did you end up getting to do? Was it a fun job or was it one of those backbreaking jobs?
You know what? I felt like I had the best of both worlds. So I had applied to do merchandising, but I also knew that was pretty competitive at the time. So I got placed in food and beverage at a resort. So I worked at Disney's Caribbean Beach Resort, which at the time was the largest hotel on property back then. And so I had a great shift. I worked from 4 p.m. to 1 a.m. every day. So I had the day to play in the parks, which for me was a dream. And I pretty much did it every day. And so I worked in kind of the fast food area, but then quickly, like within weeks, kind of got promoted to the full service restaurant where my costume became a full suit. I had a microphone earpiece as we worked the floor to seat people. And so I worked at Captain's Tavern for the rest of my experience. And so that was a little more, kind of upscale dining for that resort. And so I met some great people that I'm still friends with today and had a wonderful experience. Besides doing my senior honors thesis, I also participated in a competition where I won a scholarship while I was down there. And I had the opportunity to meet Dick Nunes, who was president of the Walt Disney World Resort at the time, because I had actually created and envisioned a new theme park. So it would have been, park number 4, or actually maybe number 3 back then, because not all of them were open. And it was a theme park called Downtown Disney, which of course Disney ended up using the name for the marketplace, the Village Marketplace, before it now became Disney Springs. But it was a theme park that was based on a downtown cityscape. So you might have a roller coaster inside of a skyscraper. I had envisioned that there would be a sports arena called the Mouser Dome that would have mouse ears on top of it as kind of an iconic tribute. I had even had, there would be a post office where you could get a special postmark. So instead of just the stamp, the postmark would have mouse ears on it. I had envisioned a gift shop or a souvenir shop that only carried merchandise for anniversaries that Disney was celebrating that year. And I think I called it the anniversary shop. So just really kind of put my creativity to work and was up for the challenge and designed it all down there, had to pitch it, walked away with a $500 scholarship and signed away all my rights to Disney.
Yeah, they got you there. But you didn't just lose connection with some people. You also have been a member of the Disney Alumni Association. What is that like for you? And do you find common experiences or common feelings among your cast member alumni brethren?
Yeah, it's great to be connected to other people who have done the program, right? Because you have something, definitely in common in terms of that experience of living, learning, and earning on the Disney College program. And, following my participation in the program, I actually served as a kind of a Disney alumni chapter advisor at my alma mater, Western Michigan University. And so I got to work with the students who were going on the program. And still to this day, with the course that I teach, I've had students who've done the Disney College program, and then they do also some will do the program after they participate in my class. And so I can relate to them, and they love to ask me questions about, my experience. And then again, I stay in touch with many of the people who were on the program with me back in the fall of 1993. And I, meet up with them in person, and we stay connected through social media. But it's just nice to know that, it is such a large network. And now with the Alumni Association kind of having the online social portal, it's a great way to connect with even, people who where I'm at in Michigan, to be able to, reach out to them, or, learn about their experience as well.
So you graduate university, and it sounds like you have plans, but it doesn't sound like teaching is a part of that plan. Was teaching always something you were interested in doing, or was there an evolution between leaving the program and figuring out what was next?
My plan had always been that I was going to take my PR degree, my journalism minor, and my French minor, and I was going to head off and go work at Disneyland Paris, right? That's what I told people, right? And then I landed a job in higher education and college admissions at my alma mater, actually the semester before I graduated. And so then I was hooked and loved being on a college campus, and have done college admissions, financial aid, enrollment management for, most of my professional career. Again, still keeping a Disney connection, connecting with people on LinkedIn that, I worked with, doing conference presentations about different things that I learned while working for the Walt Disney Company, and then applying it to higher education. So that dates back to, again, right out of college, I was doing some of that work. So, so I still kept the Disney infusion in some of the work that I was doing. And then again, it wasn't until, essentially 7 years ago that this kind of intensity about Walt's life kind of kicked in.
Well, let's talk about that intensity, because there's a connection. I'm assuming this is when you came up with the idea for the pilgrimage and for the course. What made you? I mean, it's kind of a big leap in the sense that it is a course that is one that takes you out into the world and in multiple states. It's 40 locations, I believe, in 3 states, and at least the first one was.
Yes.
Did you feel like it was a crazy idea, or something that really was just had not been tapped by anybody else?
So I had gone, what triggered all of this is in December of 2013, I had gone to Chicago to the Museum of Science and Industry to see the Treasures of the Walt Disney Archives exhibit. And it was kind of going through that exhibit that I was reminded that Walt was born in Chicago and that he grew up in Marceline. And in that same month, the Walt Disney Birthplace had kicked off a Kickstarter campaign to raise funds for the restoration of the birth home, which I pledged support of. And so it was kind of those two things that clicked. And in my head, I left that walk through the exhibit thinking, I want to grab some of my fellow Disney nerd friends, and I want to hop in the car from Kalamazoo, where I was living, and we're going to go to Chicago. We're going to go see the birth home, and then we're going to drive to Marceline, because Marceline had kind of been on my list, maybe hadn't emerged up on the bucket list, but it had been a place after seeing the exhibit that I was like, I definitely want to go there. And so I casually mentioned this to a very good friend of mine, Jules, and I said, hey, listen, I'm thinking about doing this. And she was like, wait a second, this sounds like one of the Study in the States courses at the Leanners College at Western Michigan University. We both work there. And I said, yeah, but I'm not a faculty member. I was an associate provost of enrollment management, but had graduated from the Leanners College. And she was like, well, go talk to the dean. You have nothing to lose. I was like, okay. So, because that program, Study in the States, did not exist when I was an undergraduate there. I wish it had, because I totally would have participated in it. And so I went and talked to the dean, and she was like, well, write it up. Let's see. I honestly thought it was a long shot, again, given my status and all of that. And then lo and behold, my proposal was accepted. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I actually have to put together a curriculum, right? Like, what did I get myself into? And so that's where the whole idea came from, and that was the inspiration for it.
So let's talk about the first trip. First of all, what kind of students did you find were the most interested in taking the course? And then also, what did you find were the moments during that first experience that both maybe you and your students were like, this is maybe better than we thought, in the sense of like the location, or like, because you do, of course, end in Disneyland. And that, of course, seems like the best part, like it's the icing
Right.
on the cake. But that's the one that everyone expects to enjoy. What are the ones that people weren't sure they would like, and then even yourself were like, wow, this was a great experience?
So first of all, in terms of the type of students, so Study in the States is a program of the Lee Honors College. So these are all honors students who have the opportunity to apply to one or more Study in the States programs that, again, are this experiential education, short-term trip. So my entire 3 credits is crammed into essentially 8 days of travel. There's some things before that, and then there's some work, and there's work after. It's a full credit, course with major assignments and papers and all of that, all themed around Walt Disney. And so in terms of, it's open up to all majors, and this course attracts all majors. There's not one certain type of student. I've had aviation majors, I've had nursing majors, I've had business majors, theater majors. They all come with kind of a different interest. The one thing I will tell you that from reading the essays, because that's the other thing, students have to apply to the course, which is pretty uncommon that you have to apply and be accepted. But we obviously have more people than we have space for. I can take, 8 students on this course, and that's because of cost as well as logistics of getting around. So that kind of makes up the composition. But every student who typically writes an essay, they always talk about the Disney movies that influenced them and or the Disney parks that had an impact on them. And so from the start, everybody has that in common, and everybody has some sort of Disney story that they can tell as part of their childhood and growing up. And everybody's is a little bit different, but that's a great kind of common experience that they all bring. But then because of their major and then their future aspirations, they all kind of take in the course in a varied way.
And what sort of moments did you find along that trip that sort of impacted them?
Yeah, I will tell you the one that is magical every single year that I teach it is going to Marceline. There is something about that small town where there is just some pixie dust that gets sprinkled on the students, because it is a very transformative day in Marceline. And, I so want to acknowledge Kay Malins, who's the, founder of the Walt Disney Hometown Museum, and Peter Whitehead, who's the creative director there, and then all of our friends in Marceline who just open up their doors. And for many of our students, they have never really seen kind of small town America or the middle of America. And to be able to walk in Walt's footsteps in that small town, which it's just neat to see, how life is there, and how much Walt's legacy remains, and how the story gets told, and in visiting all of the different places, because we go to sacred spaces in Walt's life. Another kind of memorable moment is day one, when we get to, see inside the birth home, and, see presumably where Walt was born, because everyone claims he was born in the house. And so to be in that space, right, to say that Walt's life started here, and then to go to his boyhood home in Marceline, to just remember the simplicity of his roots, and what life was like back in the early 1900s, when, all of the technology that students have in their hands today didn't even exist. And so it takes them back to a time in our country where, life was simple, life was hard, and just thinking about what that was like.
So let's get to that icing on the cake, Disneyland. What great experiences did the students have there?
Well, so my favorite story to tell about Disneyland, and this happened after the first year, during the first year, one of the students was complaining because it was so hot, right? Because we go to Disneyland in the middle of July. What do you expect? Yeah. And the one was saying, oh, it's so hot. And the other one was like, shut up. We're getting college credit for being at Disneyland. This is the best. And so it kind of became this joke. And and it transformed into a T-shirt that the students like to buy and wear. So they do this all themselves. We have an expression at Western Michigan University where every day is a great day to be a Bronco. And so the students have a shirt made that says it's a magical day to be a Bronco. And then the backside, it says, I'm getting college credit for being here, Walts Pilgrimage. And so it's really a conversation piece while they're waiting in line. They almost feel like celebrities when they're there, because when people find out, number one, that they followed Walt Disney's life across country, their first response is, how can I enroll? And then they just want to hear about what the students have done. And then the fact that the students are getting college credit, and they're like, you're at Disneyland. That's just insane. And so it's just neat for the students to be able to tell, what they've experienced, in that setting, and to be able to talk about the things that were important to Walt in the park, because, they've studied that.
So one of the things I'm interested in is, of course, creating this curriculum, and you have to decide what is sort of the most important aspects of his life. You can't cover everything necessarily. What I'm interested in is there a specific Disney biography that you think really captures the person best? And then also, how do you go about in sort of explaining the more complex parts of his life? I'm thinking of course, his volunteerism for the McCarthy hearings and things like that. And, even for a man who is known for having lots of magical moments, he certainly was flawed in moments as well. So I'm curious about those two things, how you like the biography, what one sticks to you, and then how do you talk about him as an actual person?
The biography that I require for the course is Bob Thomas's, Walt Disney, an American Original. I've read it multiple times now. And for me, after reading it and then going on the pilgrimage the first year and then rereading it, I'm reminded of all of the places that, just come to life, when you're reading it. And that's the book that the family recommends. I actually reached out to the Walt Disney Family Museum because I wanted to find out, what book did they believe, really encapsulates, kind of Walt's life. And so the students are required to read that. And then the other thing that I do as part of the course, which also makes it very experiential, is that I have 8 students. We have 8 days. It kind of just works out that way. So each student kind of has to be the Disney expert of the day for each city that we're going to. And so they're required to do much more intense research. I coach them. They have to provide a handout. They talk about the different stops that we're going to. And then I add to that for what I think they may have missed or additional tidbits that I just happen to know because I've been doing this, for so long. And so we talk about, the not so nice things that happened in Walt's life. So we talk about the 1941 strike and how that almost brought down the whole studio, and, how that all happened, what were kind of the working conditions. We talk about when we're at Laugh-O-Gram Film Studio in Kansas City, and we're at the site of this building that has the opportunity to be restored. We talk about, how Walt went bankrupt, and, was eating, beans out of a can, and sleeping in the studio. And then we go to Union Station where he took his showers because that was what he had to do. And then, it's pretty memorable being at Union Station because, Union Station is where Walt left to take the train to California with, $40 in his pocket and, bought a first class ticket, and so, I think them hearing about Walt's life and then, being in those sacred, places, again, everything wasn't, always beautiful and rosy for him. He experienced some pretty hard times. I mean, we can drive the route of his paper route in Kansas City, where he and Roy, had to deliver papers to upwards of, 600 to 700 subscribers at, starting at 3:30 in the morning. Like, let's talk about, how you would feel, doing something like that, at your, at a much younger age.
So eventually this course gets turned into a book. In that process, the book, of course, Walt's Pilgrimage, lays out sort of what you can do, the multiple areas that have some sort of Walt history a part of it. When did you decide that the course could be translated into a sort of a different, I guess, medium, a book opposed to a course, and was that a challenge at all?
It was actually during my second summer of teaching the course that I was, thinking about all of the information I had been collecting, sharing with the students, and realizing too that only 8 students per summer could ever do this course, right? Because it's uniquely situated at Western Michigan University, and knowing that there were lots of other Disney fans, out there who were interested in learning more about Walt's life and potentially doing their own pilgrimage, and also knowing that Walt's Pilgrimage, won't be taught forever. It's typically a course offered for 2 to 3 years. I'm kind of the exception to the rule, entering year 6 here because it is so popular and well received and impactful in students' lives. But I decided to sit down and just start. Right, I started with Kansas City as a random chapter to just see how it felt if I, started writing it, because I knew that the book was going to be this unique blend of travel guide meets biography meets history. And so I really kind of wanted to weave it together. But also, I wanted it to be this kind of self-guided tour through Walt's life. And you could pick up in any city, whatever part of the country you're in, and just start not chipping away at them, but going to what makes sense for you. And I certainly in the book offer options for different types of pilgrimages that you could do depending on what you might be looking for. But that's what inspired the book. And I basically wrote it and published it in less than 6 months, because once I got started, I couldn't stop. In fact, I had to stop because I was, approaching 400 pages, and I was like, all right. I was like, nobody wants to read, all of that. But the benefit is you can pick up again any chapter. That's why there's, so many chapters in the book, is because each chapter, is a different city. But that's what happens when I've got 80 chapters. It sounds like a lot, but some chapters are, 2 to 3 pages, and other chapters are much longer.
Well, you also decide to make a junior version of this book, and as well as ABCs of Walt, Walt's Activity Book, and Walt's Ancestors, all which are for kids. They are sort of centered around a younger audience. I find this interesting because, of course, it's not the audience that you normally teach. When you teach the course, you don't teach those kind of age groups. So what made you think, like, this is something, I know there are fans for this thing, but I want to go younger. I want younger kids to have different, not only just a junior version of your book, but also the activity book I think is very fascinating too, because it's a very specific type of book to give children about Walt. So where do the origins of these books come from?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, I think as I've taught the course, published the first book, I started realizing that as the years go by, there's going to be fewer and fewer people that really will know who Walt Disney, the person, was, right? They will know Walt Disney, the brand. So kind of in the same way that Diane Disney Miller created the Walt Disney Family Museum, I felt compelled that I want the next generation of children to know that Walt was a person, and, as a human, he had this creative mind. And this was, these are the things that, how he grew up. And so the, Walt's Pilgrimage Jr., essentially that came to be because, again, I had some great photography and wanted to be able to visually show, some of the places in Walt's life to them. The ABCs of Walt was actually inspired when I was in Marceline, and we were talking about Walt's time there, where the Wolf River apple orchard was on the Disney farm. And so all of a sudden I was like, oh, A is for apple, and then started brainstorming anything from A to Z that had a Walt connection that we could tell part of his story. And so that was the inspiration for that. So I just, sometimes I feel like Walt's energy is like with me. I mean, I feel like I think like he does. And so I'm just curious all the time, and somebody will say something or somebody will do something, and then I just take note of it. And then sometimes the time is just right, and I just kind of start, brainstorming and putting things down on paper, and then I just see where it goes. I mean, I probably have I would say probably another 5 to 10 books kind of in my mind. The one that I'm working on right now is Walt's resume, where I basically look at all of the different jobs he had, formal and informal, throughout his life, because again, a lot of people don't realize he was a news butcher, or that he worked for a short time as, for the Postal Service, or, that he served in the American Ambulance Corps over in France. And so just showcasing the diversity of his life experiences, and that, he wasn't born a cartoonist and an artist, that, developed, through his childhood. And so, as ideas come to me, I just make note of them, and I wait for the stars to align for when it's time to take it to the next level.
Well, this year, you, of course, released a book, Walts Father, Lessons from Elias Disney. And I'm curious about what made you decide to do one on Walt's dad, a figure in his life that I think unfairly gets called a failure, but certainly has that kind of stain on him for not being able to sort of keep jobs and having to move and affect Walt's life in this way. What made you a sympathetic kind of thinker about Elias Disney?
Yeah, having read so much about Elias Disney, and, he does get portrayed in such negative light because, again, he was a pretty strict, hard-nosed kind of, father. I think it was reflective of the times and the era that he grew up in. But I think as I did more research and I read more and I saw quotes that Walt and Roy and others in the family said about their father, was that they still loved him so much and respected him, even if they were frustrated by him. And so I also wanted to just weave together lots of different things that were said about Elias Disney, and, also just kind of look at the positives that might be embedded in among some of those negative comments and put them into context. And I think part of the inspiration also came, I guess perhaps for me, again, with my family being from Ontario, Canada as well, and knowing that Elias had grown up in Blue Vale, Ontario, almost 3 years ago, I did what I called the Elias Pilgrimage, and I took my friend Fareed with me, and we went and traveled to the places that I was able to document in Elias Disney's life. Not as exciting as Walt's life, because there's not things, necessarily there anymore. But to just, again, follow in those footsteps and see some of those places, I think just gave me a little bit more admiration for him. And so I, decided to do some of that research and some of that writing and pay tribute to him. And I felt it came together quite nicely. It's a short read. It's a small book. It's a 4x6 book. So again, I think it just gives you a little bit of taste, and you still are also learning about Walt while also learning about his father.
So the future holds many books in your head, as you've already said, but one that you've mentioned online is Walts Pilgrimage, but international version. What excites you about following Walt across the world?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I've, again, learned about Walt, he had, for the time, quite extensive, international travel, beyond his, South American Goodwill Ambassador trip. But, whether there was a film overseas, or, again, he was just vacationing there. I mean, one of the places I definitely want to visit, because, again, my family can be traced back to France, is to go to Isigny-sur-Mer, where Walt's family, has been traced back to and where they originated. So again, to go back to that place where the whole family, kind of got its start, would just kind of be a cool experience, to do that. So, the problem with my international pilgrimage is that, again, I feel like I would need to make to do the travels to really document it well. And the problem is I've just had all these other books that keep popping up in between. So eventually I'll get to it. I've also been thinking about an update edition to Walts Pilgrimage. It'll be 3 years this October, but as I've taught the course and done additional research, there's more that I want to, more tidbits I want to include, and some more stops that I've discovered. And that's the thing that keeps it exciting for me, is that I continue every month to just get a new kernel of information about Walt's life. And I certainly read now with the sense of geography in mind, right? Because of the sense of place. How would that fit into, his life pilgrimage?
Well, Christopher Tremblay, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Walt's Pilgrimage and yours as well. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun.
And that's it for this episode of Dreamfinders. Thanks to Christopher Tremblay for chatting with me, and make sure to check out Walt's Pilgrimage and all his other Disney books on Amazon, or learn more at his website, waltspilgrimage.com. Dreamfinders is edited by Shannon Mickelson, with quality control by Ben Harris. It's hosted and produced by yours truly, Nathan Hartman, who you can follow on Twitter at SomeStuffISaid. Our podcast artwork is provided by JP Tanner. Find his other work at tanwoodcreative.com. This podcast is distributed by WDW News Today, the worldwide leader in Disney Parks news. Read all they have to offer at WDWNT.com. Tell your friends about the show, and please give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And hey, if you or someone else you know would make a great guest on this program, feel free to email us at dreamfinders@WDWNT.com. I'm Nathan Hartman, and remember, if we can dream it, then we can do it.